She did not cry when they nailed the notice to the door. She had promised herself she would not. Nora Callahan had made that promise 3 weeks ago, the morning after her father's funeral, standing in the kitchen of the only home she had ever known, watching the candle burn down to nothing while the creditor's letters sat unopened on the table like accusations. She had looked at herself in the small mirror above the wash basin. 23 years old, dark circles under gray eyes, hair coming loose from its braid, and said the words out loud to her own reflection. "You will not cry. Not where anyone can see." She had kept the promise. Through the reading of the debts. Through the visit from Mr. Aldrich at the land office, who had explained in the careful, practiced tone of a man who enjoyed delivering bad news that the Callahan property, 40 acres of good pasture land 3 miles east of Coloma, California, had been seized against what her father owed. Through the afternoon, she spent carrying her belongings out of the house and into the barn, because the barn, at least, was still hers for another 2 weeks. They had given her that much. 2 weeks before the banker's men came to take possession of everything. It was March of 1873, and the California gold country had long since stopped being kind to people who needed kindness. The notice on the door was printed in heavy black ink. Property of the First Territorial Bank of Coloma. Trespassing strictly prohibited. Someone had pressed it crookedly into the wood with 3 nails, and one corner lifted slightly in the cold morning wind, flapping like a flag of surrender. Nora stood in the mud and looked at it for a long moment. Then she turned and walked back to the barn. Inside, in the third stall from the left, a horse lifted his head and looked at her. His name was Shepherd, and he was the most beautiful thing Nora Callahan had ever owned, which was not saying much, because she had never owned anything of particular beauty or value. But Shepherd was different. He was a blue roan stallion, 16 hands, with a coat that shifted from slate to silver depending on the light, and dark intelligent eyes that seemed to understand more than a horse had any right to understand. Her father had traded a broken-down wagon and 2 months of fence-building labor for him 4 years ago, and at the time, every neighbor within riding distance had said Patrick Callahan had lost his mind. Nora had said nothing. She had simply walked to the pasture where the roan was tied, held her hand out palm up, and waited. Shepherd had taken 3 steps toward her, dropped his nose to her hand, and breathed out slowly, as if deciding something, as if choosing. After that, there was no question of whose horse he was. She sat down on an overturned bucket just inside the stall entrance, her back against the wood, and let herself breathe. The barn smelled of hay and horse, and the particular kind of cold that comes from a California winter that cannot quite decide whether it wants to snow. Shepherd moved closer, nudging her shoulder with his nose, and she reached up without looking and pressed her hand against his jaw. "I know," she said quietly. She did not have the money to stable him anywhere in Coloma. She had calculated it 12 different ways over the past 3 weeks, and the numbers refused to cooperate. The livery on Main Street charged $2 a month per horse, and she had exactly $4.30 to her name, which would cover the stable fee for 2 months and nothing else. No food, no lodging, no way to get to the next town or the one after that to look for work. And she had already asked about work in Coloma. She had asked at the hotel, the milliners, the bakery, the schoolhouse, and the home of every woman she knew who might have need of a seamstress or a house cleaner or a cook. The answer had been polite and various and always the same. Nothing right now. So sorry about your father. What she had not told any of them was that her father had not left her only debt. He had left her a letter, found folded inside his Bible after the funeral, written in his shaking hand during the last weeks of his illness. She had read it so many times she could recite it from memory. "Nora girl, I know I have left you in a hard place, and I am sorry for it. The debts are real, and I cannot fix them from where I am going. But there is one thing I ask of you. Keep Shepherd. Whatever you have to do, wherever you have to go, keep that horse. He will take you somewhere better than this. I believe that. Your mother always said that animal had a guardian spirit in him, and I have come to think she was right. He will see you through." She had folded the letter back up and put it in the wooden box with the few other things of her mother's she still had. And then she had gone out to the barn and pressed her forehead against Shepherd's neck and stayed there until she could breathe normally again. That had been 3 weeks ago. Now the bank had the house and the land, and in 2 weeks they would have the barn, and the only question left was what she was going to do with a horse she could not afford to keep and could not bear to lose. The answer, she suspected, was going to break something in her that could not be fixed. She heard boots in the yard. Multiple sets, moving without hurry, the particular cadence of men who had no reason to rush because the outcome was already settled. She stood up, brushed the hay from her dress, and stepped out of the stall. Through the gap in the barn doors, she could see 2 men from the land office crossing the yard toward the house, ledger books under their arms, not even glancing at the barn. Taking inventory, counting what was theirs now. Shepard pressed his nose against the back of her shoulder blade. She reached back and touched his face without turning around. "Not yet," she said softly. "We have 2 weeks. I will think of something." She did not believe herself. But she said it anyway, because sometimes the only thing between a person and despair is the decision to keep talking, keep moving, keep pretending that the next day might be different from the one that came before. Outside, the March wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain. Nora Callahan straightened her spine, smoothed her dress, and went to face the men from the bank. The man from the land office was named Pritchard, and he had the kind of face that looked like it had never once been troubled by doubt. He was standing in the yard when Nora came out of the barn, clipboard in hand, reading something with the self-satisfied squint of a man who enjoyed having things in writing. His associate, younger, thinner, stood slightly behind him holding an inkwell and looking like he would rather be anywhere else. Nora recognized that feeling. "Miss Callahan." Pritchard did not look up immediately. He finished whatever he was reading first, which she suspected was deliberate. "We are just completing the inventory assessment. Should not take more than an hour." "The barn is mine for 2 more weeks," she said. The agreement was the 14th. The agreement. He said it the way men like him always said things that women said, with a slight flattening of tone, as though repetition alone could reveal the naivety of the original statement. "Yes, the barn and its contents until the 14th. That is correct." He made a note on his clipboard. "The horse will need to be removed by then as well, of course. He is not part of the seized property, but he cannot remain on bank land past the transfer date." "I'm aware of that." "Good." He finally looked up at her. His eyes were the color of weak coffee and held approximately as much warmth. "Do you have arrangements in place?" "I am working on it." Another note on the clipboard. She had the distinct impression he was writing no arrangements in his careful accountant's hand. "Very well. We'll be out of your way shortly." He turned back to his clipboard. Nora stood in the yard for a moment, the wind pulling at the loose hair around her face, and then walked past him toward the road. She needed to go into town. She had been putting it off because going into Coloma meant walking past the house with the bank's notice on the door, and she had not been ready to do that twice in one day. But there was a woman on Sutter Street, a Mrs. Deering, who ran a boarding house and had mentioned 3 weeks ago, before the funeral, before everything, that she might have need of a kitchen helper come spring. It was a small hope, barely worth the walk, but Nora had run out of large hopes and was working through the small ones methodically, the way her father had always worked a problem. Start with what you have. Move from there. Coloma was not a large town, but it was a busy one, sitting as it did at the intersection of 2 mining roads and within a day's ride of Sacramento. The main street was a mix of permanent buildings and structures that couldn't quite decide whether they intended to stay. Canvas roof storefronts, half-finished facades, a hotel that was grander than the town strictly warranted. The gold rush that had made the region famous was 25 years gone, but the infrastructure it had left behind drew enough ranchers and merchants and travelers to keep the town alive. Nora walked with her eyes forward and her chin level, the way her mother had taught her. You can feel whatever you need to feel on the inside. The outside is what the world sees, and the world will treat you according to what you show it. She was passing the Coloma Savings and Trust, a building she had come to regard with a specific loathing usually reserved for natural disasters, when she heard the argument. It was coming from the alley beside the livery stable, 2 voices, one loud and one low. The loud one belonged to a man named Gus Heller, who ran the livery and was known throughout Coloma for a business acumen that stopped just short of outright dishonesty. She recognized his voice before she saw him. The second voice was one she did not recognize at all. She would have walked past. She had enough of her own trouble without borrowing someone else's. But she caught one word from the stranger's low voice. Patient, unhurried, carrying the particular weight of someone who was accustomed to being the calmest person in any given situation, and the word stopped her. Horse. She slowed without meaning to and glanced toward the alley. Gus Heller was red-faced and gesturing, his hat pushed back on his head. Across from him stood a man she had never seen before. Tall, genuinely tall, not the kind of tall that came from good boots and a straight posture, but the structural kind, the kind that came from bone. He had dark hair, longer than was fashionable, and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same granite that made up the Sierra Nevada foothills. He wore a long brown riding coat, trail-worn but well-made, and he held his hat in one hand with the easy patience of someone who had learned that holding onto things loosely was better than gripping them tight. He was listening to Gus Heller with an expression of complete calm that somehow managed to communicate, without a single word, that he found the entire situation mildly tedious. "I told you the rate when you rode in," Heller was saying. $3 a month, same as I tell everyone." "You told me too," the stranger said. Not heated, just factual, the way you might correct a column of numbers. "I told you too for a mule or a pony. That animal of yours is neither. Big horse like that eats double. $3 is fair. $2 is what we agreed." The stranger turned his hat slowly in his hand. "I will pay $2. If that is not acceptable, I will take my horse and find a different arrangement." Heller's jaw tightened. He was not used to being disagreed with in that tone. The tone that was not aggressive, not apologetic, simply immovable, like a fence post that had been driven into the ground by someone who knew exactly how deep it needed to go. "Fine," Heller said finally, with the clipped fury of a man conceding a point he knows he lost fairly. $2. But feed's extra. Feed was included in the original agreement as well. The stranger produced 2 coins from his coat pocket and held them out. "Good doing business with you, Mr. Heller." Heller took the coins, muttered something that did not bear repeating, and disappeared back into the stable. The stranger turned and found Nora standing at the alley entrance, having failed entirely at the task of walking past without being noticed. He looked at her without surprise, as though he had known she was there. His eyes were dark, a deep brown that caught the afternoon light in a way that made it difficult to look away from them quickly once you had looked. He was younger than she had initially thought from a distance. 30, perhaps, or close to it. "Sorry," she said, because she had been staring. "I was not. I did not mean to listen." "It was not a private conversation," he said. Heller was not interested in keeping it quiet. There was a faint pull at one corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Something more restrained than that, as if smiling were something he did carefully when it was warranted. "Are you new to Coloma?" she asked, and then immediately wondered why she had asked it, since it was not her business and she had places to be. "Passing through," he said, "looking at some land north of town. A spread that is up for sale." He settled his hat back onto his head. "Are you from here?" "Born here," she said. And then, before she could stop it, "Though it does not feel much like home at the moment." She did not know why she said that. She did not say things like that to strangers. She pressed her lips together and looked back toward the main street. "I'm sorry to hear it," he said, and he said it the way some people said things, without the social gloss, without the performance of sympathy. Simply and directly, as though he meant it and did not feel the need to decorate the meaning. "Nora Callahan," she said, and held out her hand because her mother had raised her to be direct even when she was embarrassed. He shook it. His grip was firm but not demonstrative. "Reid Calloway." "Mr. Calloway." "Miss Callahan." She nodded once, turned, and continued down the street toward Mrs. Deering's boarding house, telling herself that her pulse was elevated because of the walk in the cold and the general stress of her circumstances, and not because of anything else whatsoever. Behind her, she heard nothing. No footsteps following, no further words. When she glanced back once, briefly, just to check the road, Reid Calloway was gone, back into the livery, and the alley was empty. She faced forward and kept walking. Mrs. Deering was a small woman with large opinions and a boarding house that smelled permanently of boiled cabbage and commercial ambition. She received Nora in the front parlor with the careful courtesy of someone who had already made up her mind but wanted to deliver the news in a setting that reflected well on her own character. "I did think of you," she said, folding her hands in her lap. "When the position came open, I truly did think of you, Miss Callahan. But I have taken on a girl already. A cousin of the Hartley family, come down from Sacramento. It would not be right to turn her out now that she is settled in." "Of course," Nora said. "Your father was a good man. I want you to know that. Everyone in Coloma knew Patrick Callahan was a good man." "Thank you. If something else opens up, I will certainly keep you in mind." "I appreciate that." She walked back out into the cold afternoon and stood on the boarding house steps for a moment, looking at the street. A wagon rolled past, kicking up dust despite the damp. Two women in good coats crossed at the far end of the block, heads bent toward each other, talking. A dog was asleep in a doorway, one ear twitching at something only it could hear. Nora counted to 10, slowly, the way her mother had taught her when she was small and prone to the kind of feelings that needed somewhere to go. Then she descended the steps and walked back toward the barn. She tried 2 more places that afternoon. The hotel kitchen, where the manager told her kindly that he had all the staff he needed through the summer. The dressmakers on the cross street, where a woman named Miss Ponte listened politely and said she might have something in the fall. The fall. As though Nora had until the fall. As though the bank's notice on the door read, "Please vacate by autumn at your earliest convenience." By the time she returned to the barn, the light had gone the color of old brass, and Shepard was watching the door with the attentive patience he always showed when she had been gone longer than usual. She went into the stall and stood with her arms around his neck for a long moment, not speaking, just breathing. The arithmetic was the same as it had always been. No amount of walking through it again would change the numbers. She had $4.30. She had 2 weeks before the barn was gone. She had no position, no family within riding distance, no friend wealthy enough to help and close enough to ask. And she had a horse that she could not afford to keep. She spent the evening doing what she had been doing every evening since her father's funeral, sitting on her bedroll in the corner of the barn with a candle, working through possibilities in the small notebook she used for figures. She wrote things down and crossed them out. She had considered selling her mother's locket, but the locket was gold-filled, not solid gold, and even the most generous estimate put its value at under $3. She had considered writing to her father's brother in Oregon, but they had not spoken in 11 years, and she did not know his address, and even if she had, a letter took 3 weeks, and she did not have 3 weeks. She had considered, in the very darkest hour of one very dark night, whether she could simply ride Shepard north and find work somewhere that did not know her name or her father's debts. She had crossed that one out quickly. Running was its own kind of debt, and she had enough of those. At some point, she must have fallen asleep, because she woke to Shepard's soft nicker and the gray pre-dawn light coming through the gaps in the barn boards. She lay still for a moment, listening. Birds, wind, the distant sound of a rooster from one of the farms down the road. Ordinary sounds. The world continuing its business regardless of whether Nora Callahan had figured out how to exist in it. She sat up, rubbed her face, and looked at her notebook. At the bottom of the last page, in handwriting that was less steady than her usual hand, she had written one line she did not remember writing. "The auction is on Friday." She stared at it. Friday was 3 days away. The livery held a monthly horse auction at the paddock behind the stable, and she had known it was coming. She had been not thinking about it with great deliberate energy for a week. The horses that went through Heller's auction generally sold well. Coloma drew buyers from Sacramento and as far as Stockton, and a blue roan stallion as sound and well-trained as Shepard would fetch a good price. $60, perhaps. Possibly more if the right buyer showed up. $60 would give her time. Real time. Enough to get to Sacramento, find proper work, start over somewhere that the name Callahan did not carry the weight of her father's debts. And Shepard would go to whoever had $60 and wanted a horse, which could be anyone, which could be a freight company or a mining outfit or a man who had no patience and heavy hands and no understanding of what it meant that this particular animal had chosen her in a pasture 4 years ago and had been choosing her every day since. She closed the notebook. She put another cross through the auction line. Then she opened the notebook again and looked at the cross and understood, with the quiet and terrible clarity that only comes in the very early morning when there is no one to perform courage for, that she was running out of crosses. She was still sitting there when Shepard lifted his head sharply, ears pricked toward the barn door. Someone was in the yard. She stood quickly, moving to the gap in the barn doors and looking out. The sky was pale gray and the yard was empty except for— She looked again. A horse, tied to the fence post near the road. A big animal, dark, standing with its head up, and a man crouched at the edge of the yard, examining something on the ground. He stood as she watched, and even in the gray, pre-dawn light, and at this distance, she recognized the height, the brown coat, the unhurried quality of movement. Reid Calloway. He was looking at the bank's notice on the house door. She watched him read it. He stood very still, the way she had noticed he stood when he was processing something. Not frozen, but contained, as if stillness were a tool he had learned to use deliberately. Then he turned and looked directly at the barn, and even across the yard and through the gap in the door, she had the unsettling sensation that he could see her watching him. She pushed the barn door open and stepped out. Mr. Calloway. Miss Callahan. He did not appear startled. I apologize for the hour. I was riding past and saw the notice. She crossed the yard toward him, arms folded against the cold. You know where I live. Coloma is a small town. I asked at the hotel. He paused. That sounds less reasonable out loud than it did as a plan. It sounds like the behavior of a man who wants something, she said, because she was tired and it was before sunrise and she had no patience left for navigation. He met her eyes steadily. It sounds like the behavior of a man who heard something in town yesterday that he could not stop thinking about and wanted to understand better. What did you hear? That Patrick Callahan's daughter was about to lose her horse. The words landed quietly, the way he seemed to deliver everything, without drama, without softening, just the thing itself set down plainly. Nora said nothing for a moment. The wind moved through the yard. Shepard knocked softly against the barn boards from inside. What is it to you? She asked. Not unkindly, genuinely. Reid Calloway looked at her with those dark, light-catching eyes and said, I am not entirely sure yet, but I would like to find out if you are willing to have a conversation. The sky was beginning to pale at the eastern edge, the first colorless suggestion of dawn spreading over the hills. Nora Callahan looked at this man she had met once for 3 minutes in an alley beside a livery stable and made the calculation that tired, cornered people make when they have run out of all the safe options. She looked at him and decided, provisionally, carefully, with every reservation she possessed still fully intact, to listen. Come inside, she said. I will start the fire. The inside of the barn was warmer than the yard, which was not saying much, but the small iron stove in the corner, one of the few things Nora had managed to move from the house before the bank took possession, put out enough heat to make conversation comfortable. She built the fire with the economical movements of someone who had done it 10,000 times and did not need to think about it. Reid Calloway stood near the door with his hat in his hand, and she noticed again that he had the particular quality of occupying space without imposing on it. Some men, when you brought them into a room that was yours, immediately made it feel like theirs. He did not do that. She set the small tin coffee pot on the stove and turned to face him. Sit down, Mr. Calloway, or don't. But say what you came to say. He sat on the 3-legged stool near the stove, settling his long frame onto it with the mild resignation of a man accustomed to furniture that was not built for him. He turned his hat in his hands once. She was beginning to recognize this as a habit, something he did when he was ordering his thoughts, and then set it on his knee. I rode out yesterday to look at the Harmon property, he said. North of town, about 6 miles. You know it. I know it. Old Sheep Station. The Harmons left for San Francisco 2 years ago. The land is good. Better than I expected. There is a creek that runs year-round, good grass, a stand of timber on the north ridge. The house needs work, but the bones are sound. He paused. I put in an offer this morning. She waited, not sure where this was going. The problem, he continued, is that running a property like that alone is not practical. I have the cattle knowledge and the capital. What I do not have is anyone to manage the domestic end of the operation while I build the herd. The last time I tried to do both simultaneously, I nearly burned down my own kitchen in Colorado. The corner of her mouth moved despite herself. Ow! Unattended beans. It is a longer story than it deserves to be. He said it without a smile, but there was something behind it, a dry awareness of his own absurdity that she found unexpectedly disarming. The point is, I need someone who can run a household. Cooking, managing supplies, keeping things organized. Room and board, and $35 a month. Nora was quiet for a moment. The coffee pot began to make sounds. That is a generous wage, she said carefully. It is a fair wage for skilled work. I have been in enough poorly run households to know what the skill version is worth. He met her eyes. I am not offering you charity, Miss Callahan. I'm offering you a position because I need one filled, and you are, by every account I have heard in the 24 hours I've been in Coloma, capable of filling it. What accounts? She could not help asking. You have been here one day. The woman at the hotel told me your father's ranch was the best kept small property in the county before his illness. The man at the feed store said you could stretch a dollar further than anyone he had dealt with. Mrs. Deering, he paused slightly, told me you came looking for work yesterday with the kind of dignity that made her feel bad about saying no. Nora felt something tight in her chest. She turned to check the coffee, so he would not see her expression. Mrs. Deering talks a great deal, she said. Small towns are useful that way. She poured 2 cups, handed him one, and leaned against the barn wall with the other. The fire was warming the space properly now, and the early light was beginning to come through the high window above the empty 4th stall. What about Shepard, she said. He did not ask who Shepard was. He had been watching the blue roan since he sat down. What about him? He comes with me, or I do not go. That is not a negotiating position, Mr. Calloway. That is simply true. Reid looked at the horse for a moment. Shepard looked back with the calm sovereignty of an animal that understood it was being discussed. The Harmon property has a good barn and 2 working corrals. I intend to run horses as well as cattle eventually. A well-trained stallion is an asset, not a liability. He looked back at her. Bring him. He stays mine, she said. On paper, in practice, in every way. I'm not trading one form of losing him for another. Something shifted in Reid Calloway's expression. It was not offense. It was closer to recognition. The look of someone who has heard a truth they already understood from their own experience. He stays yours, he said. I would not have it any other way. She studied him. She was good at reading people. Her father's later years had required it. The constant calibration of which version of him she was dealing with, what the set of his shoulders meant, what a particular silence was building toward. She had developed the kind of perception that came from living with uncertainty, and what she perceived in Reid Calloway was not performance. He was not telling her what she wanted to hear. He was telling her what was true because it was simpler than telling her anything else. Why me, she asked. The same question she suspected that every woman in her position asked when something appeared that looked too much like rescue. There are women in Sacramento who would take this position. Women with references and experience in proper households. Probably, he agreed. But I am not in Sacramento. I am here. He picked up his coffee cup. And there is another reason. She waited. I rode past this barn twice yesterday, he said. Before I came to ask at the hotel. I saw you in the yard in the morning when I first came into town, and I saw you again in the afternoon coming back from Sutter Street. And both times I noticed the same thing. What thing? You were carrying something very heavy, he said quietly. Not literally. But I have seen that particular weight before on my own mother the winter after my father died, when everything had fallen and she was the only one left to figure out which pieces could be salvaged. It is a specific kind of tired. The kind that comes from fighting alone for too long. He looked at the coffee cup. I did not help my mother in time. She made her own way eventually, but it cost her more than it should have. I have thought about that a fair number of times over the years. The barn was very quiet. Outside, a bird started up in the cottonwood near the fence, a bright, persistent sound in the gray morning. "This is not about your mother," Nora said. Not accusatory. Just making sure. "No," he said. "It is not. My mother is well and living comfortably in Oregon and would be deeply amused to know I cited her in a business proposition." The almost smile again there and gone. "This is about a practical need I have and a practical solution that also happens to benefit someone who deserves a better hand than the one she has been dealt. That is all it is." "That is all," she repeated. "For now," he said, and then seemed to decide that was more than he had intended to say, and looked back at the stove. "For now." The words sat in the air between them like the steam rising from the coffee cups. Not a promise, not a declaration. Simply an honest acknowledgement that the present moment was not the whole story, that there was a later that neither of them could see yet, and that this was all right. Nora Callahan was not a reckless woman. She had never made a decision without turning it over first, examining it from every angle, identifying the ways it could fail. But she was also her father's daughter, and Patrick Callahan, whatever his failures, had understood one thing completely. He had stood in a field with a blue roan stallion that everyone said was a bad trade, and he had looked at the animal and known, without being able to explain it, that this was the right thing. She looked at Reid Calloway with the same instinct and arrived at the same conclusion. "I will need 3 days to settle things here," she said. "There is the matter of the barn contents. Some tools that belong to my father. I would like to sell what I can and pack the rest. 3 days is fine. The property transfer on the Harmon land will take at least that long. And I want the terms in writing," she said. "Wage, position, Shepherd's ownership. All of it. I will have it drawn up this afternoon." She nodded once. He stood, unfolding himself from the inadequate stool, and picked up his hat. "Mr. Calloway," she said before he reached the door. He turned. "Why did you say ride? I'll be right behind you." She had heard him say it to her, just barely, as she walked away from the alley yesterday. She had not acknowledged it at the time, had filed it away to examine later. Later was now. He was quiet for a moment. "Because you look like someone who needed to know that the road ahead of them was safe," he said, "and that they did not have to check behind them to make sure they were alone." She held that for a moment. Then she held out her hand. He shook it, same grip as before, certain without being forceful. 3 days, she said. 3 days, he agreed, and walked out into the morning. Nora turned back to the stove, picked up her coffee cup, and stood for a long moment staring at the small fire through the grate. Shepherd moved in his stall, a soft, rhythmic sound, the comfortable shifting of an animal that was calm. "All right," she said quietly to both of them. "All right." The Harmon property looked different from the road than it did up close. From the road, coming north out of Coloma on a cool March morning with Shepherd moving easy beneath her and Reid Calloway's wagon rolling 20 yards ahead, it looked like most abandoned California ranch properties looked, weathered, a little hunched like a thing that had been waiting a long time and was not entirely sure the waiting was over. The main house was low and wood-framed, the white paint gone gray and peeling at the corners. The barn was larger than the house and in considerably better condition, which Nora had heard was common with ranchers. They always fixed the barn first and got around to the house when they could. But as they turned off the road and came down the long approach lane, the property revealed itself differently. The lane was lined on both sides with old valley oaks, their branches meeting overhead in an arch that turned the morning light green and gold. The creek Reid had mentioned ran along the eastern edge of the property, visible as a silver thread through the grass. And the grass itself was good, thick and wintergreen, the kind that spoke of decent soil and reliable water. The hills behind the house caught the early sun on their upper slopes while the valley floor was still in cool shadow, and the effect was like looking at something that was just beginning to wake up. Nora felt something loosen in her chest that she had not realized was tight. Reid pulled the wagon to a stop in the yard and climbed down. He stood looking at the house with the expression of a man conducting a private accounting, then turned to help Nora down for Shepherd. She was already on the ground by the time he reached her. She had not needed help getting off a horse since she was 8 years old, and she suspected he knew that and was offering the gesture rather than the assistance. She appreciated the distinction. "The water pump is around the side," he said. "I checked it 2 days ago, and it works. The well is deep, which matters in the dry months." He moved toward the house. "Come and see." The inside was dim and smelled of closed rooms and old wood and faintly, very faintly, of the lavender that someone, Mrs. Harmon, she supposed, had once hung in bundles from the kitchen beams. The bundles were still there, long since dried to gray, rustling in the draft from the open door. Nora stood in the kitchen and looked at them for a moment. "The range is cast iron," Reid said from behind her. "I had someone check the flue yesterday. It is clear." She went to the range and examined it. It was older but solid, the kind that would hold heat all day if you managed it right. The firebox was clean. Someone had swept it out before the Harmons left. She moved through the kitchen into the front room. Stone fireplace, plank floors, 2 windows that led in the morning light in long rectangles. A door off the far wall led to a short hallway with 3 rooms off it. She looked into each one. 2 were empty. The third, at the end of the hall, with a window looking east toward the creek, had a bed frame still in it, plain wood, the mattress rolled up in the corner. "That room is yours," Reid said from the hallway. "If you want it." "Where do you sleep?" "There's a room above the barn. I prefer it. I like being close to the horses." He paused. "The house is yours to run as you see fit. I will not be underfoot." She turned from the window and looked at him. He was leaning against the door frame, arms crossed, watching her move through the space with the same quality of attention he had shown in the barn. Present, unhurried, not trying to influence what she was deciding. "You're good at that," she said. "At what?" "Waiting for people to make up their minds." He considered this. "I learned early that pushing does not generally improve the outcome," he said. "Things that are worth having are worth waiting for." She turned back to the window. The creek was visible from here, just a gleam through the oak branches. A hawk was drifting on the thermal above the eastern hill, making slow, patient circles. She thought about the barn in Coloma, the candle, the notebook full of crossed-out possibilities. She thought about Pritchard from the land office and his weak coffee eyes. She thought about her father's letter, folded in the wooden box that was now in her saddlebag. "He will see you somewhere better than this." "I believe that. I would like to start with the kitchen," she said. "It will take most of today to get it properly sorted, and I would rather do it before anything else." "I will be in the barn," he said. "There is lumber in the outbuilding if you need shelves put up. I can do that this evening. I will let you know." He pushed off the door frame and headed back through the front room, and she heard his boots on the porch steps, then the yard, then quiet. She stood in her room, a thing she had not had in 3 weeks, and looked at the rolled mattress in the corner and the window and the creek beyond it. Then she took off her coat, hung it on the nail inside the door, and went to find a broom. The kitchen took the better part of the day, as she had expected. She swept first, moving every movable thing out to the porch and going after the corners and the ceiling beams with the long-handled broom she found in the back room. Dust and old cobwebs and 2 generations of dried insects. She scrubbed the range with a brick and rendered fat she found in a sealed crock in the pantry, then blacked it properly until it gleamed. She sorted the pantry shelves, discarded what was beyond saving, and inventoried what remained. There were staples, flour, dried beans, salt, a sealed tin of lard that the Harmons had apparently not considered worth taking. Enough to work with. She made bread that afternoon, not because it was the most efficient use of her time, but because the smell of bread baking was the fastest way she knew to make a strange place feel less strange. She mixed the dough by feel, the way her mother had taught her, adding flour until it came right under her hands, then set it to rise on the warm surface beside the range. At some point during the afternoon, she heard Reid moving in the yard, the sound of wood being split, rhythmic and steady, and felt something settle in her that she could not quite name. It was not comfort exactly, not yet, and it was not trust, which took longer than an afternoon. It was something smaller and more preliminary than either of those things. The simple recognition that there was another person nearby who was doing useful work and not requiring anything from her, and that this was not nothing. After weeks of absolute solitude, it was actually a great deal. When the bread came out of the oven, she sliced it and carried 2 pieces out to the yard without quite deciding to do so. Reid was at the woodpile, his coat off despite the chill, working with the kind of focused economy that came from a man who had split a lot of wood and no longer needed to think about it. He looked up when she came out, and she held out the bread without preamble. He took it, looked at it, and took a bite. He chewed. His expression did not perform anything. He simply ate, and then said, "That is good bread." "I know," she said, and he looked at her, and she saw it then for the first time. A real smile. Not the quarter smile she had seen before, but the full version, brief and unguarded, there and gone like sunlight through cloud cover, and it rearranged his face so completely that she had to look away. She went back inside and attended to the soup she was making for supper, and did not think about the smile, and was largely unsuccessful. That night, she lay on the re-stuffed mattress in her room and listened to the creek and the cattle lowing somewhere in the dark hills and the wind in the oaks. Strange sounds, new sounds, but not frightening. Not, she realized with some surprise, frightening at all. Shepherd was in the barn. She was in a room with a window and a door with a latch. The kitchen was clean and the range was warm, and tomorrow was a day she had not yet had to survive. For the first time in weeks, Nora Callahan fell asleep quickly. The first month at the Harmon property, she still thought of it that way, had not yet made the adjustment to thinking of it as anything else, established a rhythm that surprised her with how natural it felt. She rose before dawn. She had always risen before dawn, even as a child, something in her constitution refusing to waste the quiet hours. She started the range, put the coffee on, and used the early dark to do the work that required concentration. The accounts, the supply lists, the planning that kept the household from unraveling at the edges. By the time the sky began to lighten, she had the shape of the day in her mind, and she moved through it with the particular efficiency of someone who had learned that time was a thing you could either use or lose, and losing it was expensive. Reid was an early riser too. She heard him in the barn most mornings before she saw him. The sounds of horses being fed and watered, the occasional low word to an animal. He came to the house for breakfast at first light, ate without ceremony, said what needed to be said about the day's work, and went back out. He did not linger. He did not fill silence with noise. These were qualities she had not known she valued until she encountered them consistently. The ranch hands arrived in the second week. 2 men Reid had hired out of Coloma. A Mexican horseman named Domingo, who had the easy confidence of someone who had spent his life working with animals, and a taciturn older man called Walt, who communicated primarily through the angle of his hat brim and an economy of syllable that Nora found, against her expectations, rather restful. They came to the house for meals, which Nora had decided without being asked, because feeding working men was practical and because she had learned from her father that the quality of a ranch's food was a direct reflection of how seriously the operation took its people. Domingo, in particular, had opinions about Shepherd. "That is a good horse," he told her one morning, watching her work the roan in the small corral. "You trained him yourself?" "My father started it. I finished it." "How old is he?" 6. Domingo leaned on the fence rail and watched Shepherd move through the pattern Nora was asking of him. The easy responsiveness between horse and rider that came from years of quiet work together. "He could sire some very good foals," Domingo said. "The boss has been talking about building a horse breeding program. That stallion could be the foundation of it." "Shepherd is mine," Nora said pleasantly, "but I am open to discussing terms." Domingo laughed, the kind of laugh that started in the chest. "You sound like the boss." She glanced over at him. "Is that a compliment?" "With him, yes." He pushed off the fence. "He does not say things he does not mean." "Neither, I think, do you?" She filed that away and said nothing. It was in the 4th week that the incident with the supply run happened, and it mattered more than it should have. She had driven the wagon into Coloma for supplies: flour, salt, coffee, nails, and a length of oilcloth for the pantry shelves. She went alone, as she had the 2 previous times, because she preferred it and Reid had not suggested otherwise. She was loading the wagon outside the general store when a man she did not recognize stopped on the boardwalk and made a remark to his companion that she was not meant to hear. She heard it. It was the kind of remark that men like that made about women in her situation, a woman living on a ranch with a bachelor employer, no family nearby, no obvious social position. The words were not unusual. She had been bracing for them since the day she arrived. She had told herself she would not react when they came, that they were the cost of the circumstances and not a reflection of her worth, and she had believed herself when she said it. What she had not anticipated was how tired she was. The specific exhaustion of a woman who has been holding herself together with great care for a very long time, and how much it cost, in that moment, to simply pick up the next sack of flour and load it without her hands shaking. She drove back to the ranch with her jaw set and her eyes forward. And when Reid came out to help unload, he always came out to help unload without being asked. He took one look at her face and said, "What happened?" "Nothing I could not handle." He picked up a sack and was quiet for a moment. Then what happened? She told him. She did it concisely, without dramatizing it, because she was not looking for fury on her behalf, and she did not want the story to become larger than it was. She told him the way she would have told anyone, plainly, the facts, what was said and by whom. When she finished, Reid set the sack down on the porch with a deliberateness that was very controlled. "I know who that is," he said. "He has a spread east of town. He has also been asking around about the Harmon land, apparently, and is not pleased that someone bought it before he could." "So, what is about you?" Nora said. "And I am the instrument." "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "I am sorry. That is my fault, not yours." "It is neither of our faults," she said precisely. "It is his fault. But that is not how these things work, and we both know it." He was quiet for a long moment. "I could go speak to him and confirm everything he is implying about the nature of our arrangement." "No." She picked up the oilcloth. "What you can do is make sure that anyone in Coloma who asks knows exactly what my position here is and that you consider it worth defending." "I already do that," he said quietly. She paused, looked at him. "Do you? Every time it comes up." He held her gaze without any discomfort. "I said I would not let anyone slander you." "I meant it." She stood in the yard with the oilcloth under her arm and felt something crack open very slightly in the careful structure she had built around herself. Not much, just a hairline, just enough to let a little of the pressure out. "Thank you," she said. "You do not need to thank me for that," he said. "You just need to know it is true." She nodded and went inside. She stood in the kitchen for a moment with her back against the closed door and breathed and told herself that the pressure behind her eyes was tiredness and nothing more. In the evenings, they had fallen into a pattern without discussing it. After supper, when the dishes were done and the ranch hands had gone back to the bunkhouse, they would sit on the porch. Not close, the porch was wide enough to make that a choice rather than a circumstance, and sometimes talk and sometimes not. It was during these evenings that she learned him in the way that you could not learn a person from facts alone. She learned that he had come to California from Colorado, where he had ranched for 5 years after 2 years in Wyoming before that. She learned that he had taught himself surveying from a library book and used that skill to earn money between ranch jobs when he was starting out. She learned that he had a sister in San Francisco who wrote him letters he always answered within the week, and a profound distaste for men who were careless with other people's time. He learned that she had wanted, as a child, to be a botanist, that she had a small collection of pressed California wildflowers that had survived the move from the house in the wooden box with her mother's things. He learned that she could recite the book of Psalms from memory, not from particular piety, but because her mother had used it to teach her reading and the words had settled into her permanently. He learned that she was afraid of exactly one thing that she would admit to, which was being invisible, being the kind of person that circumstances simply erased. "You are not in any danger of that," he said one evening when she told him this. "How do you know?" He looked at the middle distance, the dark hills, the stars emerging. "Because invisible people do not argue about contract terms before dawn," he said. "And they do not make bread that makes a person feel like they have been somewhere safe." She said nothing for a long time after that. The coyotes started up somewhere to the north, the sound carrying clear and mournful across the valley, and Shepard answered from a barn with a single low note. "Mr. Calloway," she said finally. "Reid," he said. It was the third time he had suggested it. "Reid," she said, and felt the words settle into place like a key turning over. "I think you should know that I am not a person who does things without thinking about them first. I know that. And I am not a person who lets herself be managed or redirected or handled. I know that too." "Good," she said. "I wanted to be clear." He nodded slowly, his eyes still on the hills. "Crystal," he said, and she heard in his voice the careful warmth of a man who was being very precise about what he was allowing himself to feel, and she recognized it because she was doing exactly the same thing. The stars wheeled overhead. The fire in the porch lantern guttered in the breeze and steadied again. Below in the barn, Shepard was quiet. The man's name was Garrett Hollis, and he arrived on a Tuesday morning in April without invitation or warning. Nora was in the kitchen garden she had been coaxing back to life from the neglected patch behind the house, on her knees in the good dark soil, when she heard the horses in the yard. She stood, brushed the dirt from her skirt, and went around the corner of the house to find two men on horseback and a third she did not recognize standing in the yard with his reins in his hand, looking at the property with the evaluating squint of a man pricing things. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, well-dressed in the particular way of men who wanted to look like ranchers, but had not spent enough time outdoors to complete the effect. Good hat, clean boots, a coat that had not seen a winter. He had sandy-colored hair going to gray at the temples, and a mouth that sat in a naturally dismissive expression, as though everything it encountered fell somewhat short of expectation. "Miss Callahan," he said before she could speak. So he knew her name. "Is Calloway about?" "Mr. Calloway is on the North Range," she said. "We'll be back by noon. Is there something I can help you with?" Hollis looked at her the way he had looked at the property. "I am Garrett Hollis. I have a ranch east of Coloma. You may have heard the name." "I have." "Then you know I made inquiries about this land before Calloway bought it." He said Reid's name with the flat familiarity of a man dismissing someone's significance. "I want to make him an offer to buy it back. A generous one. I came to deliver that message, and I thought perhaps you might convey it." "You can convey it yourself at noon," she said pleasantly. Hollis's mouth thinned slightly. "I would rather get a sense of the situation first. How Calloway is finding the property. Whether the operation is going as planned." His eyes moved over the house. The garden came back to her. "Whether he intends to stay. I imagine he will tell you that himself. Friendly conversation, Miss Callahan. That is all." He shifted his weight. "You know, there's talk in Coloma about this arrangement. I imagine you are aware of it. I am aware that some people in Coloma have very little else to occupy their minds," she said, in the same pleasant tone. Hollis looked at her for a moment, recalibrating. He had, she suspected, expected either more deference or more agitation, and her steadiness was disrupting his approach. "You are very composed for someone in a precarious position," he said. "My position is not precarious," she said. "I have a contract, a wage, and a horse. I am doing precisely what I came here to do. What I cannot account for is why my position is of interest to you." "Just concerned," he said, with the smile of a man who was not. "A young woman, no family, out here with a man she barely knows." "Mr. Hollis." Reid's voice came from behind Nora, and she turned to find him coming around the far side of the barn on horseback, having come down the creek track rather than the main approach. He must have seen the horses from the ridge. He rode into the yard without hurry and dismounted with the unhurried ease she had come to recognize as his version of deliberateness. "This is unexpected. Calloway." Hollis straightened slightly despite himself. Reid had that effect. She had noticed his height and his stillness combined into something that made other men unconsciously adjust their posture. "I came to discuss a business matter." "I heard the last part of your conversation," Reid said. "We can discuss business. The other part of the conversation is finished." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The sentence simply closed the topic the way a door closes. Not slammed, just shut. "What is your offer?" Hollis named a figure. Reid was quiet for a moment, then named his counter, which was not a counter at all, but a statement that the property was not for sale, delivered with such complete disinterest that it took Hollis a moment to understand he had been dismissed. "You are making a mistake," Hollis said. "I make my own mistakes," Reid said. That is something we probably have in common. Good morning, Mr. Hollis. Hollis looked at him, then at Nora, then back at Reid. He put his hat on, turned his horse, and rode out with his two companions behind him. They watched until the horses were on the road and moving back toward Coloma. Nora let out a breath she had been holding for the last 5 minutes. "How much did you hear?" she asked. "Enough." Reid turned from the road. His expression was controlled, but there was something underneath that she had not seen before. Something with an edge, not directed at her, but present. "He has been the source of most of the talk in town. I guessed. I should have dealt with it sooner." "You cannot stop people talking," she said. "I told you that at the beginning." "No, but I can make it very clear that anyone who brings that talk to your door will answer to me for it." He paused. "Are you all right?" "I am fine." She meant it. She had been more shaken by the supply run incident than by this. This she had been able to meet head on, which was always better. He is trying to destabilize the operation because he wants the land. "I am incidental." "You are not incidental," Reid said, with a directness that was slightly more direct than the usual register of their conversations. She looked at him. He appeared to be aware that he had said something that went somewhat beyond the practical scope of the discussion, because he looked briefly at the ground and then back at her with the expression of a man who has decided that having said the thing, he will stand behind it. "I meant," he said, more carefully, "that your comfort and safety here are not incidental to me." "That is what I should have said." "That is not all you said," she pointed out, because she was not a person who let things go unsaid when saying them mattered. "No," he agreed. "It is not." The yard was very quiet. One of the horses in the corral moved, a soft thud of hooves on packed earth. "Reid," she said. "Nora." It was the first time he had used her given name without the miss in front of it, and it landed differently than she expected. Not jarring. The opposite of jarring. Like something arriving that had been in transit for a long time. "I have been thinking," she said carefully, "about the way this situation is developing." "As have I," he said. "And I want to say that I am aware of the complications. My position here, the dependency. I will not pretend those things are not real. They are real," he agreed. "And I have thought about them too, which is why I have not said anything." He turned his hat in his hands. "I did not want you to feel that I was leveraging the situation." She looked at him steadily. "Are you?" "No," he said, and she believed him entirely. "I'm doing the opposite. I'm trying very hard to give you room." "I know," she said. "I have noticed." She folded her arms, not defensively, just something to do with her hands. "I would like you to stop." He went very still. "Stop giving me room," she said. "I've had 3 weeks of room, and I am clear-headed, and I know my own mind, Reid, and I would rather you say what you mean than spend another month being careful with me." He looked at her for a long moment. The edge that had been in his expression when Hollis was there was gone. What was under it was something much quieter and considerably more significant. "I'm falling in love with you," he said. "I have been since the morning in the barn, possibly since the alley. I am not certain of the exact moment. I did not plan it, and I am not sorry about it. And if you tell me it is not something you can return, I will respect that, and nothing between us will change. But you asked me to say what I mean." The afternoon light lay across the yard in long golden bars. Somewhere in the oak trees, a meadowlark was working through its entire repertoire. "I'm not going to tell you that," Nora said. He held her gaze. "No, no." She unfolded her arms and took 3 steps toward him, which put her close enough to see the exact quality of the light in his dark eyes. "I'm going to tell you that I think you are the most careful, most honest, most quietly extraordinary person I have met in my life, and that I have been trying for 3 weeks not to be in love with you and have completely failed." He reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back, and took her hand. She had not stepped back. They were married in June. 12 weeks after the morning, she had carried Brett out to the woodpile. The ceremony was held on the ranch because Nora had no family to bring to a church, and Reid had said he preferred the sky overhead to a ceiling, which was such a specific and characteristic thing for him to say that she had loved him more for it. The traveling minister who served 4 counties came through on a Thursday, and they used that Thursday. Domingo and Walt were witnesses. Both of them cleaned up to a degree that suggested genuine effort. Domingo wept openly and appeared completely untroubled by this. Walt produced from somewhere a wildflower arrangement of surprising quality and presented it to Nora before the ceremony with the same economy of expression he applied to everything, which meant she had to look away quickly to compose herself. She wore the best of her 3 dresses, the dark blue one that had belonged to her mother and had been let out and taken in and let out again over the years until it fit Nora like it had been made for her. Reid wore a dark coat she had not seen before, clearly purchased for the occasion and clearly purchased by a man who was not accustomed to shopping for himself, because it fit him in the shoulders and was slightly short in the sleeve, and somehow this made her feel more tenderly toward him than any amount of perfect tailoring would have done. When a minister asked if she took this man, she said yes without hesitation or performance, simply and clearly, as though answering a question she had already settled privately. Reid's hand in hers was warm and certain. Afterward, there was a meal that Domingo had been secretly orchestrating for a week, beef and fresh bread, and a pie that Walt had procured from somewhere and refused to explain. They ate in the yard in the long summer evening, and for the first time since her father's death, Nora Callahan sat at a table, outside, under the oaks, with the creek running silver in the distance, and felt entirely, unreservedly, in the right place. That night, in the room that had been hers and was now theirs, Reid was quiet and careful and exactly himself, which was more than enough. He told her she was the best thing that had happened to him since he arrived in California. She told him she was beginning to think her father had been right about Shepard. He asked her what she meant. She told him about the letter, the part about the horse seeing her through to somewhere better. Reid was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I would like to read that letter someday." "You can read it tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," he agreed, and held her closer, and outside the window the California night was warm and full of cricket sound and the smell of grass, and Shepard was peaceful in the barn, and the ranch was theirs, and the morning was coming. The years that followed were built from the same material as all good years: hard work, accumulated small joys, the particular satisfaction of watching something grow that you have tended carefully. The Calloway Ranch, which they named the Blue Creek Spread for the roan-colored quality of the water in the creek on winter mornings, grew from a modest operation into one of the most productive middle-sized ranches in the California foothills. Reid expanded the cattle herd methodically, the way he did everything, without rush, with great attention to quality. Nora managed the household and the books, because Reid had discovered early in their arrangement that she had a facility with numbers that exceeded his own, and he was entirely without ego about this. "You do it better," he said, when she suggested he might want to handle the ledgers himself. "So you should do it." This was the quality she loved most in him, the complete absence of a need to be the authority on everything, the genuine satisfaction he took in other people's competence. She started a kitchen garden that became, within 2 seasons, large enough to supply not only the ranch, but several neighboring families. She put up preserves and dried herbs and traded surplus produce at the Coloma market, adding a modest but consistent income to the operation that Reid told her she could do whatever she pleased with, and which she largely reinvested in seeds and equipment and the occasional book. Shepard sired his first foal in the summer of 1874. A blue roan filly that Domingo declared the finest young horse he had seen in 10 years. By 1878, there were 6 Shepard offspring on the ranch, and Reid had begun selling trained horses to buyers from Sacramento and San Francisco who were willing to make the trip for quality. It was not yet the breeding operation he had envisioned, but it was the beginning of one, and beginnings, Nora had learned, were not nothing. In the spring of 1875, their first child was born. A daughter, born in the room with the east window, with the creek just visible through the glass and the meadowlarks going in the oaks. They named her Clara, for no particular reason except that when Reid said the name, holding the baby with a carefulness that undid Nora completely, it sounded right. Clara was a solemn, bright-eyed child who walked at 10 months and talked at 14, mostly to Shepard, who received her attentions with the patient dignity he brought to everything. Reid taught her to sit a horse at 3, and she was fearless on horseback in a way that made Nora simultaneously proud and terrified. Their son Patrick came 2 years after Clara, named for Nora's father. He had Reid's dark hair and Nora's gray eyes, and a disposition that combined the best qualities of both of them. Patient and curious, methodical but not rigid, with a deep love of the land that seemed to have been built into him from the beginning. Garrett Hollis never made another offer on the property. He sold his own ranch in 1876 and relocated to Sacramento, where Nora heard he had gone into banking, which she felt was the appropriate destination for a man of his particular character. Carlos from the general store retired in 1879. Mrs. Deering sold her boarding house and moved to be with family in Oregon. The town of Coloma grew and changed around them, new buildings going up, old ones coming down, the railroad inching closer every year. The world was changing, had always been changing, was always in the process of becoming something different from what it had been, and Nora found that she did not fear this the way she had once feared things. She had a place to stand. That changed the quality of everything else. Shepard lived to be 22, which was a good long life for a horse who had worked hard and been loved well. When he began to fail in the winter of 1889, Nora spent every evening in the barn with him, sitting in the straw with his head in her lap, talking to him the way she had always talked to him, quietly about whatever was in her mind, treating him as the thoughtful audience he had always been. Reid would come and sit with her, not because she asked him to, but because he understood that some things you did not leave a person to do alone. When Shepard was gone, they buried him under the largest of the valley oaks at the east end of the property, with a creek light came through the branches in the morning. Reid made a marker of good oak wood and carved it simply. Shepard, faithful, chosen well. She stood at the marker for a long time, her hand on the wood, and thought about a pasture in Coloma, a hand held out palm up, a horse taking 3 steps toward her and breathing out. As if deciding, as if choosing. Reid put his arm around her, and she leaned into him. He did his job, she said finally. He did, Reid agreed. My father said he would see me somewhere better. Your father was right. She looked at the oak tree, at the light moving in the leaves, at the creek running silver over its stones. He was, she said. Nora Callaway died in 1921 at the age of 71 in the room with the east window. Reid had been gone for 4 years by then. He had gone the way she had always known he would, quietly, without drama, in his sleep, in the barn loft where he had always preferred to sleep when the weather was good and the stars were out. Clara had found him in the morning, peaceful, as if he had simply decided the night was a fine place to rest, and had stayed. He was 67. He had never been ill a day in his life that anyone could point to, and the doctor said his heart had simply finished its work, which was as dignified an ending as anyone in that country ever received. Nora had buried him under the oak with Shepard. It had seemed right. It had seemed like what he would have wanted, to be close to the horse that had begun everything, to lie in the ground of the ranch he had built, in the shade of the tree by the water he had loved. She had lived 4 years past him, not because she was trying to and not because she was not, but simply because her body had more work in it and she used it up. She kept the household. She tended the garden. She read to her grandchildren in the evenings, Patrick's 3 and Clara's 2, gathering them in the front room by the fire and going through the books she had been collecting for 40 years, the ones that had come from a store in Coloma on that first supply run, and the ones she had bought every time she went to Sacramento, and the ones that Reid had brought her without comment on his own trips, setting them on the kitchen table and not making anything of it. She taught the grandchildren to press wildflowers between the pages of heavy books, the way her mother had taught her. She showed them the original collection, the California blooms she had pressed and cataloged as a girl, dreaming of botany, dreaming of the kind of ordered, beautiful knowledge that turned living things into something you could hold and name. The collection was worn now, some of the specimens faded, the paper soft with age, but it was intact. She had carried it through everything, and it was intact. In her last weeks, Clara barely left the house. She sat with her mother in the evenings the way Nora and Reid had once sat on the porch, and they talked about things that had not been said, and things that had been said so many times they had become a kind of prayer, and things that only need to be felt and do not require language at all. Tell me again, Clara said one evening. About the alley. Nora smiled. She had told this story so many times it had become family myth, had taken on the particular quality of stories that are loved in a legend. But she told it again because Clara had asked, and because some stories deserve to be told as many times as there are people to hear them. She told about the barn in Coloma, the bank's notice, the notebook full of crossed-out possibilities. She told about Shepherd in the stall in the dark, the 2 weeks, the arithmetic that would not cooperate. She told about walking into town and passing the alley beside the livery stable and hearing a voice she did not recognize, low and unhurried, and the word horse stopping her where she would otherwise have walked on. She told about the handshake in the alley entrance, the name exchanged, the walking away. She told about waking before dawn to find a man crouching in her yard, reading the bank's notice by the gray pre-dawn light, and going out to meet him, and the fire she built in the small iron stove, and the words he said. I would like to find out if you are willing to have the conversation. She told about the bread, the mile between them that closed slowly, the way real miles always closed. Not all at once, but step by step, each day a little shorter than the last. She told about the wagon on the road to Coloma, and the way his voice had sounded in the alley, calling after her the first day, just loud enough for her to hear. Ride. I'll be right behind you. Clara was quiet for a long moment after she finished. Did you know? She asked. When he said that, did you know what it would become? Nora thought about it honestly. No, she said. I knew I believed him. That was enough for that day. And now? Nora looked at the east window. Through it, in the afternoon light, she could see the oak tree, the shadow of it long across the grass, the creek just visible. Now I think your father was right, she said. We saved each other. I thought for a long time that he had saved me. And he did. But I gave him something too. He told me once, near the end, he said he had been building a ranch for years, and it was only after I came that he understood what he was building it for. She closed her eyes. Love is not about the big moments, she said. It is about the morning you bring bread to the woodpile without deciding to. It is about the evening you sit on the porch and say nothing because nothing needs to be said. It is about choosing the same person every ordinary day and finding that the choosing never gets less. She paused. Your father chose me every day for 46 years. I chose him back. Clara took her hand. They sat in the quiet room with the evening coming in through the east window, the light going from gold to rose to the deep blue of dusk, and outside the oak tree held its shadow on the grass, and the creek ran on. In 1973, exactly 100 years after Nora Callahan had stood in the mud outside a barn in Coloma and told herself she would not cry, the Calloway family held a gathering at the Blue Creek Ranch. The ranch was still in family hands. Patrick's grandson had modernized the operation, new equipment, improved bloodlines, a small breeding program that Shepherd descendants had anchored for 2 generations before the line was bred out into the wider herd. The house had been expanded twice and the barn rebuilt once, but the east window in the original room still looked out over the same oak tree, and the creek still ran the same particular shade of blue-silver in the winter mornings that had given the property its name. The marker under the oak had been restored twice, the wood replaced when rot took it, the words recarved each time by family members who felt the responsibility of preservation. Shepherd, faithful, chosen well. Beside it, 2 granite stones set level in the ground. Reid Calloway, 1843 to 1917. He built his dream and shared it. Nora Callahan, 1850 to 1921. She brought the bread and stayed. The second inscription had been Clara's choice, and the family had let it stand because it was exactly right, specific and intimate and true, the kind of memorial that only works if you know the story, and everyone who needed to know the story knew it. At the gathering, the eldest attendee was Patrick's youngest daughter, now 89, who had known her grandmother personally and could remember the sound of her voice and the particular way she had of looking at you when she was paying attention, as though she was genuinely interested in what you had to say and had enough respect for you not to pretend otherwise if she was not. She stood at the oak tree in the afternoon light and told the assembled family what her grandmother had told her. Near the end, about the night she had decided to trust a stranger. She said she did not make the decision because she was certain it would work out, the old woman said, her voice carrying the particular clarity that sometimes comes with great age, a voice distilled down to its essential quality. She made it because she had run out of the wrong kind of certainty, the certainty that nothing would get better, and she had just enough room left to try a different kind. She looked out at the ranch. She said that hope is not the belief that things will be fine. Hope is the willingness to take the next step without knowing. And she said that a man who tells you to ride ahead and promises to be right behind you, and then that is not a small thing. She paused. That is everything. The family stood in the long grass under the oak tree, in the country that Nora and Reid had made their own, in the light of the late afternoon sun that had been falling on this particular piece of California earth for longer than any of them had been alive. And somewhere in the hills, in the part of the ranch where the creek widened and the grass grew thickest, a horse lifted its head and looked toward them with dark, attentive eyes, and for a moment it was possible to believe that some things chose you back.